Hi, everyone. It's Sue, and I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about ways of knowing, really as that key component of the foundation for nursing knowledge, and recognizing where we've been, how this all ties with who we have been as a profession and our role within society, and how this continues to structure what we know about the world, what we know about people, and what we know about our own roles. So remember, we've all learned about this before, and also today, a big surprise, there's something new. So it's really important to focus on the way we come to know things, our understanding. And you remember, we've talked about before, that idea that knowing something and knowledge of something are two different things. So knowledge is external to us. We receive knowledge. It comes to us, but it's not necessarily our own. Knowing is our own. And in that sense, that process by which we take external information, whether that's observable information, something we've heard, something we've read, something we take for granted as truthful, or something that we may even be uncertain about, and then we internalize it through various processes of judgment and analysis, emotional recognition, and other kinds of human processes. And that mechanism by which we come to know things is something that's really critical in our ability to be knowledge workers, knowledge users. And so recognizing that there are multiple different perspectives from which we approach any kind of information, any kind of situation about human beings and the world that they live in, and how we tease that information apart, and also how we bring that information together is really critical for us. And so that classic framework of ways of knowing began around 1978 and moving into the 1982, 83, 84 with works of a very eminent nursing scholar, Barbara Carper. And she really analyzed the field of knowledge and how within it nurses come to know things within any given situation, and identified 4 ways of knowing. Now I'm going to provide a brief summary here, and in the next few slides I'm going to keep talking about that, just to make sure you feel confident that you've got those key elements, but I know you do. So I'm going to remind you all, empirical knowing. Now empirical knowing is the one that we often hear about the most when we talk about science. Right? So hard science, bench science, even medical science. So empirical knowing, that's kind of information that can be tested and verified, right? That we arrange information into various theories, and that it's concerned with things like monitoring disease and disease response. Ethical knowing is really important. Ethical knowing within our profession defines the moral knowledge that we have, and it's based on the values within our profession. And remember that because of that, the Canadian Nurses Association has an ethical framework which guides our profession as well. And it's important also to recognize that each of us has our own personal ethical values. Sometimes those two things work hand in hand. Sometimes there's a collision in values between the profession, the values of the profession, and our own personal values. And that's a really important situation for us to ponder when we find ourselves in it, and to really consider how we continue within our role within the profession when there may be some sense of conflict. Aesthetic knowing is an interesting term. Many of you I know have heard of it. We often refer to aesthetic knowing, and even in this course, there'll be some aesthetic component as you move towards the end. We refer to it as the art of nursing. Now, in recent times, the art of nursing has often been misinterpreted to mean art as in artistry only. So poetry, sculpture, drawing a picture, something like that. But it's really important to recognize that aesthetics is also the artistry of our profession. So the artistry of doing a sterile dressing, the artistry of an important dialogue or conversation. That's the aesthetic component within nursing. And then finally, personal knowing. That's an awareness of yourself, and in particular, an awareness of yourself in a relationship, right? And so it doesn't require necessarily that we bring in those other ways of knowing, but typically personal knowing that is not anchored with an appreciation of other ways of knowing can be difficult to recognize as sort of unbiased. And so it's really important that in personal knowing, we often engage in reflective processes that enable us to consider our own knowledge within the context of what other people might be experiencing within any given situation. This personal knowing is a really important because often our empathetic responses come from that. And nurses as knowers bring that really important ability to engage empathetically with others. And finally, we're going to talk about emancipatory knowing. Emancipatory knowing is that idea that we recognize the world around us has, in addition to all of the wonderful things, some inequities and some injustices. And in the face of those, nurses have a responsibility to respond. We have a responsibility to stand up, to identify those inequities and injustices, and to fight to ensure that they are resolved. So if you think about what emancipation means, that means to set free. And so to set people free from things that are holding them back, that are unjust and unfair. So let's talk about those ways of knowing just a little bit more. A quick little video clip, take a moment and review it. It's just a fun one. It has some nursing students doing song and dance kind of thing with the ways of knowing. And just a little bit fun because it's also aesthetic in its interpretation. And then another one. This is actually, I think, really well done. This is a presentation, and it really, again, goes over those basics of the ways of knowing and is worth the minute and a half or so it'll take for you to review it. Okay, so again, I know you know it, but just so you feel you know it, here we go. Empirical knowing. It's the science of knowing, right? We have theories, concepts, principles. This is where we have those research findings, and historically that's been quantitative or numbers-based research, observation-based research. More even to qualitative research sometimes now falls under empirical knowing, but it's that the hard science. And so in nursing and outside of nursing, there's empirical knowing, and it's really valuable and important, but often other fields can be very heavily weighted towards this kind of knowing. A good example for us in nursing is medicine. So medicine often is really heavily weighted towards empirical knowing. And it's important, right? So if I want to know if an antibiotic has an impact on a specific kind of bacterial infection, I want empirical knowing. So I want to have seen the results of those clinical trials that show that there is an effect. I also want to see those results of those in vitro. So the scientific tests that show what the reaction of that specific bacteria is to the specific antibiotic in a petri dish. I want to know all of that stuff. So empirical knowing is important, but empirical knowing in the health sciences also can be a little bit of a bully. So empirical knowing can really have an impact in terms of being seen as carrying the greatest credibility. And that is not fair. All ways of knowing are critically important. And in each situation, we may rely on one way of knowing more than others. But empirical knowing is just one of those four ways. And a really important understanding of empirical knowing is that idea that we see in the scientific process, right? Scientific method, where we develop a hypothesis, we determine how we can test that hypothesis, and then we observe for the results of that test and make a determination. And finally, just a note that one of the big trends we see now in healthcare, the evidence-based practice, which is often very interprofessional in nature, is rooted in empirical knowing in particular. Okay, ethical knowing. So again, the moral component of nursing, and that's where we're making those judgments, those decisions, our interpretations moment to moment about what's right and what is not right, and what we are responsible for doing. It's really important that in any given situation, we clarify the values that are inherent. What we know is that often in situations of conflict, it's not that there is one right thing to do and one wrong thing to do, but rather people are experiencing real conflict between what they think is the most important element of a situation, and clarifying how you are valuing the different elements in any given situation is really critical in resolving that kind of conflict. What we also know from research is that when nurses experience situations where there's no right choice, or there might be a choice that seems to be the best one, but it is not in any way possible, that nurses experience something called moral distress, and that it is very difficult for nurses to overcome that feeling that they cannot accomplish what is right. They either cannot find a right choice or they cannot accomplish a right choice is incredibly distressing for nurses, and that's well documented. Personal knowing is so important. And this doesn't mean it's just all about myself and it's navel gazing. Personal knowing involves knowing ourselves in order to be with others in authentic relationship. And that's critical to nurses because, again, when we work with people, they're not objects, right? People are human beings. We are with them authentically in relationship that should be healing and geared towards helping them to heal. And that's multidimensional. And so it's really critical that we know ourselves because we can inflict harm on others if we're not clear of who we are and what we're bringing to that situation. And so personal knowing is really centered around this idea of primacy of relationship. Relationship is central. And also that, that as I engage authentically with another person or a family or a group or community, that that I as a person caring for them and that person or group or community being cared for, we engage meaningfully through this process of personal knowing. Okay, aesthetic knowing, again, often referred to as the art of nursing. And that's really, it really helps us to find deep meanings in situations. What we know is that when we look at a picture, when we feel a sculpture, when we listen to music or a song, that takes us to a much deeper place, that art crosses over in our brain between left and right brain and really helps us to find that, that creative element within ourselves and often tied very deeply to emotion. So again, aesthetic knowing can be formal in terms of poetry or a drawing, but it can also be our nursing practice. So the actions that we take part in as part of our, the artistry of our profession. And there's a little clip for you to watch. Just take a few minutes and take a look at it. I hope you'll find it interesting. It is it's the clip of a Ryerson nursing student, Joseph DePaz, and he creates an aesthetic representation there by singing of community nursing. So I hope you enjoy it. Okay, new one, hooray, emancipatory knowing. This is the fifth pattern of knowing identified in the 80s and into the 90s by eminent nursing scholars, Peggy Chin and Leona Kramer. And they're both important nursing scholars, but also in the feminist tradition. Feminist tradition really looks to make sure that everyone has a voice and everyone is considered equal in the world. And so emancipatory knowing draws upon our long legacy in nursing of standing up for others and making sure that we are speaking out for equity, right? That everyone has the same chance in life, that everyone has the same conditions in which to thrive. And so really in terms of this way of knowing, it calls upon us to look outside ourselves and to be aware of and to really deeply reflect on what are the social, the cultural, and the political elements around us and how are they intersecting with human beings, the human beings that we care for in the world that we care about. And it calls upon us to question why social injustice occurs. And more than just question it or theorize about it, it calls upon us to take action to address inequity, and that's really critical. So it calls upon us to speak out. Now, it's really important. Sometimes people get nervous. They get nervous that maybe not everyone has the same values, maybe not everyone looks at a situation the same way or believes the same things. That's true. And that's why we use all of the ways of knowing, right? So we look at a situation from multiple perspectives. Because our voice is important in the world. Nurses' voice is important, but we also can't be so afraid to be politically correct, always on the side of the majority or on the side of the people who are important, because change takes sometimes a little bit of collision, right? And making sure that we speak for those who don't have a voice has been part of nursing's legacy for forever. And sometimes that comes at a cost. And so that part is really important that we recognize that's part of what we do. Nurses hold a privileged place in society. We are important in the world. We're recognized as valuable in the world. And because of that privilege, we are required to speak out. Because we will be listened to, we are required to use our voice. And that's critically important. So in terms of emancipatory knowing, I'm going to give a couple of examples that again, might be controversial. We all have different perspectives on them. And emancipatory knowing doesn't require that we all believe the same thing all the time. It requires that we look at the evidence in a variety of perspectives. Again, that comes from empirical knowing. It requires that we come from a place of personal knowing. What have we experienced, and how do I reflect on that? It requires that we bring in aesthetics. It requires that we bring in ethical knowing. What are the common values within our profession? And so let me just give a couple of examples that I think are current and maybe relevant and also controversial, because I think there's some merit in being controversial. So let's think for a moment about the NFL football players, and starting with Colin Kaepernick. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago now, making that decision that he saw such inequity and experienced inequity in policing in the United States, and the issues of racism, that he needed to make a public protest, that he had a place of privilege in being an NFL football player and very successful. And in response to that, he needed to make a statement, because otherwise he was just skating by and people were suffering, and he believed that he needed to use his voice in a certain way. And so he began these quiet protests during the national anthem in the States. And whatever you believe about them, so again, I don't want us to get carried away about whether you believe that is the right thing or the wrong thing for him to be doing. This is part of emancipatory knowing, that process where you see an inequity, and in this case, their issue was policing and racial profiling, and the issues around racism, and the judicial system in the United States, very deeply entrenched in the conditions in the United States. And their belief, his belief, and other colleagues of his belief, that because they had this place of privilege as NFL players, they needed to use that privilege to speak out, and the protests that emerged from it. Another example I think that's really relevant and current, again, not a nursing example, is the Me Too movement. That idea that speaking out for injustice, when you have a voice and helping others to find their own voice, is so critical in making a change in the world. And so that's something I think for all of us to attend to and be aware of, that as the world changes, we need to be aware of the possibility for creating opportunities for important progress by finding our voice and using our voice. And that within nursing, this is not just a nice thing for us to do. We're not just heroic if we do it. This is necessary. It is essential. It is part of our nursing mandate. So we must do this. So how do the patterns intersect? And it's really important to recognize that emancipatory knowing right in the center. So remember, we've got that empirical knowing at the bottom. That's the science, the hard science, just the facts, the theories. We've got ethical knowing, so our common professional values, our code of ethics, but also personal values and beliefs that come into that. We've got personal knowing, so what we have experienced, how we process information and our own life experience, and how we engage meaningfully and relationally with others. We've got aesthetic knowing, which is the artistry of nursing, and that can be, again, just classic artistry, but also the artistry of our own skills-based practice. And all of those come together, all of those ways of knowing come together as we look at the world, as we look outside of ourselves, and we recognize where there is injustice, where there is inequity, and we respond to it, and we bring that forward. We can't presume what information here within this realm is most important, that all of those patterns are equally important in our practice in a theoretical sense, and that it's in the moment that we as nurses engage with the information that we are processing by analyzing it, by reflecting on it, and that in the moment thinking on our feet involves some degree of intuition and our kind of gut feeling about what is most important in all of these different realms. But we don't just jump in. We are reflective and analytical, making sure we have all of the information and determining what is our best response. And so it's really important that we don't overrepresent one kind of knowing, one way of knowing versus the others. We always bring together our ways of knowing and recognize that there are multiple facets to any situation. And Chin and Kramer describe a process called patterns gone wild. And that happens when we just really focus on, let's say I'm only focusing on aesthetic knowing in a situation as opposed to all of the other ways of knowing, or I'm only focusing on empirical knowing, just the facts, when in reality, the situation is not about the facts, the situation is about the ethics of a particular situation. So patterns gone wild is really an important concept for us to keep in mind, because it really represents that imbalance between one way of knowing versus another. And as nurses, we are knowledge workers. And to be a knowledge worker, it means we need a process by which we can bring together all of those different ways of knowing. So here's that question. Why do we need that? One, to avoid those patterns gone wild. To acknowledge the importance of learning that occurs not just in an academic setting, in a classroom, online, but learning that occurs anywhere. To bring together that sort of congruence, that balance between our own nursing practice and the research and the theory that happens in all kinds of different settings, that's being developed in all kinds of different settings. It helps us to formulate that professional identity, to support our own self-identity, and to develop greater confidence in clinical settings, in our own practice, to stimulate that critical reflection and thinking that's necessary. CNO advises us that that is absolutely necessary in terms of our own standards of practice. We know that it's necessary in terms of our own professional development as nurses. This improves nursing practice. Looking at situations from all of these multiple perspectives critically improves nursing practice. It helps us to not only develop greater knowledge, but to express that knowledge, to share that knowledge. And it helps us to develop this strong collective identity within our profession. I hope you found this helpful. A little bit of a review around, again, ways of knowing in nursing, the four classic, empirical, aesthetic, personal, and ethical knowing, and that new way of knowing identified by Chin and Kramer, emancipatory knowing. How critical it is that all of those ways of knowing are employed in various situations, that the nurse, as the knowledge worker, employs all of those ways of knowing and determines how to respond to any given situation in a thoughtful, reflective, analytical way, and recognizing that we have a responsibility to employ our final and fifth way of knowing, emancipatory knowing, in order to bring about change in the world that promotes justice and equity.